The Colosseum of Rome is often remembered as a symbol of grandeur, engineering brilliance, and the entertainment culture of the ancient world. But behind the shining marble, roaring crowds, and monumental architecture, the reality was darker, crueler, and far more inhumane than many imagine. For centuries, Rome's arenas were theaters of death, where life was cheap, suffering was celebrated, and brutality was disguised as entertainment. Today, many people imagine gladiators as heroic fighters, but the truth of what really happened in those arenas shows how far Rome was willing to go to shock its people and maintain control. The Roman elite knew that the population of Rome was restless. Millions of poor citizens, many unemployed and frustrated, needed distraction. The solution was the games. Bread and circuses, as Roman writers said, kept the masses satisfied. But the spectacles had to keep escalating. Once people grew used to gladiator duels, the rulers of Rome introduced even bloodier and more disturbing acts. These acts pushed the limits of cruelty until the games were no longer just sport, but horrifying rituals of humiliation and suffering. One of the most infamous practices was the execution of criminals and prisoners in the arena. But this was not done through quick or simple methods. Instead, executions were staged as dramatic performances, known as damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to beasts. Criminals were thrown unarmed into the arena, where lions, leopards, bears, or packs of dogs would rip them apart. The crowd roared with excitement, and the suffering of the condemned became a form of public entertainment. The victims were often tied to stakes, smeared with blood, or dressed in costumes that mocked them before being set upon by animals. It was not only death, it was humiliation, and it was carefully designed for spectacle. Sometimes, these executions were reenactments of myths. For example, criminals might be dressed as Orpheus, then torn apart by animals, just as in the myth. Others might play Hercules and be burned alive to mimic his fiery death. These were not plays, they were real executions disguised as theater. The Romans blurred the line between drama and cruelty, forcing condemned men and women to die in roles that entertained the public. Imagine thousands of people cheering as a man, dressed in costume, screams in agony while flames consume him, simply because Rome believed that suffering could be art. Another brutal feature of Roman arena acts was the mass slaughter of animals. Exotic animals from across the empire were brought to Rome in staggering numbers. Lions from Africa, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile, and even rhinoceroses were forced into the Colosseum to fight and die. Sometimes animals fought each other, sometimes they fought gladiators, and often they were killed in elaborate hunts called venations. These hunts were not fair battles. They were staged massacres where hunters slaughtered dozens or even hundreds of animals to impress the crowd. At the opening of the Colosseum, Emperor Titus is said to have killed more than 9,000 animals in just one set of games. The scale of death was unimaginable. The cruelty extended even further. Romans sometimes chained animals together to create bizarre spectacles. An elephant might be forced to fight a bull, or a lion against a bear. These unnatural combats were designed to shock the audience with novelty and bloodshed. To the Romans, the suffering of animals was irrelevant. What mattered was the thrill of seeing something no one had seen before, and if thousands of living creatures had to die for the sake of entertainment, so be it. The gladiator duels themselves were not always noble fights between skilled warriors. While some gladiators trained and developed reputations, many others were slaves or prisoners, forced into combat with little preparation. They were thrown into the arena to be slaughtered quickly for the amusement of the crowd. Some were given poor weapons, broken shields, or no protection at all. The odds were stacked against them, and their deaths were nearly guaranteed. To the crowd, it was not about fairness, it was about blood. What made these acts even more disturbing was how the Roman crowd participated in the cruelty. Spectators cheered, laughed, and demanded more suffering. Thumbs up or thumbs down gestures decided the fate of wounded gladiators. If the crowd wanted mercy, a man might be spared, but often mercy was denied. Gladiators begged for their lives, bleeding and broken. While the audience shouted for their death, the crowd was part of the execution. Rome's arena turned ordinary citizens into participants in cruelty, feeding an endless appetite for violence. And yet, the emperors knew exactly what they were doing. The games were political tools. When an emperor needed to win favor, he staged bigger and bloodier spectacles. The more outrageous the acts, the more the people were distracted from poverty, corruption, or war. One emperor, Commodus, even fought in the arena himself. He slaughtered animals and humiliated weaker gladiators to prove his power. But it was not bravery. His opponents were chosen carefully so that he would always win. Commodus turned the games into his personal theater of vanity, showcasing how Rome's rulers could twist cruelty into propaganda. Some of the most shocking arena acts were reserved for special occasions. During celebrations, criminals might be forced to fight each other to the death in large groups with no armor or training. Imagine 50 men armed with daggers, stabbing one another until only one was left alive. These were not skilled gladiators. They were desperate men fighting for the slim chance to survive a single day longer. To the audience, it was exhilarating. To the condemned, it was terror beyond words. There were also punishments for rebellious slaves and enemies of the empire. The famous revolt, led by Spartacus, ended with thousands of captured rebels being crucified along Roman roads. In the arena, smaller groups of captured rebels were executed in brutal fashion to remind everyone of Rome's power. The message was clear. Anyone who defied Rome would not only lose their life, but would lose it in the most painful, humiliating, and public way possible. The arena was not only entertainment, it was political theater designed to terrify. One of the most grotesque acts ever recorded involved the use of burning as punishment in the arena. Some victims were tied to posts and set on fire as living torches. The crowds watched their agony as the flames consumed their bodies. Sometimes this was done at night to illuminate the games. Human beings were reduced to lanterns, burning for the enjoyment of the masses. The idea that life could be extinguished in such a cruel display shows just how far Rome was willing to go for spectacle. The treatment of women in the arena was another dark chapter. Though rare, there are accounts of women being forced to fight as gladiators or being executed in grotesque displays. Some were thrown to animals, while others were used in theatrical punishments meant to humiliate them in front of thousands. The combination of misogyny, slavery, and spectacle made their deaths even more degrading. Rome's arenas had no boundaries when it came to cruelty. Over time, the appetite for violence kept growing. Each generation of Romans expected more blood, more novelty, and more outrageous displays. Simple duels were no longer enough. The emperors responded with bigger spectacles, larger hunts, and crueler executions. But this hunger for blood also revealed something deeper about Rome. It showed how a society built on conquest and slavery normalized violence until it became entertainment. The same empire that built aqueducts, roads, and laws also turned cruelty into a public festival. Eventually, the brutality of the games began to disturb even some Romans. Philosophers like Seneca criticized the cruelty, describing how audiences became addicted to blood. He warned that the games corrupted morality, turning people into savages who delighted in suffering. But his voice was a minority. The games continued for centuries until Christianity began to spread and moral opposition to the arena grew stronger. By the 5th century, gladiatorial combat had largely ended, but by then, millions of men, women, and animals had already died in Rome's quest for entertainment. When we look back at the Roman arena today, it is easy to admire the architecture of the Colosseum or the bravery of certain gladiators. But we must also remember the darker truth. These were not noble contests of honor. They were brutal, inhumane, and deliberately designed to dehumanize. The victims were not only killed, they were humiliated, tortured, and forced to entertain in their final moments. The lesson is powerful. Even the greatest civilizations can fall into cruelty when power and entertainment are valued more than humanity. Rome believed that the arena was a way to unite its people, distract its citizens, and glorify its emperors. But in reality, it revealed the empire's darkest side. The Colosseum may still stand, but its stones are stained with the memory of suffering that went too far. The story of Rome's arenas is not only history, it is a warning. It shows how violence can become normalized, how cruelty can become entertainment, and how power can corrupt entire societies into celebrating inhumanity. Rome may have fallen long ago, but the lessons of its brutal games remain as relevant as ever.